Um, should I accept? Okay. And so, as I just hinted at, historians, other scholars have generally portrayed the 1950s as a decade of job stability and economic advancement for auto workers. So they rode the post-war boom. They had lucrative union contracts. They achieved middle-class status. That's what scholars have said. That's what I still hear almost on a weekly basis, even though my book's out. But anyways, first and foremost, historians have argued that auto workers saw their real wages double in these years, between the end of the war in 1960 and started to enjoy fringe benefits like pensions and company-paid health insurance, which did appear in contracts in this period. Historians have also emphasized large numbers of new auto workers that entered the industry after World War II, during World War II and after World War II, and have emphasized that those newer workers didn't seem familiar at all with the big organizing campaigns of the 1930s that brought the UAW into existence. And there was some regret about that they didn't seem to understand all that had gone into creating the situation they entered. But they seemed, according to the scholars, to be much more interested in getting a toehold in consumer society, riding that post-war boom, and not so interested in militant union activity, strikes, this sort of thing. So historians also argued that grievance procedures, kind of the slow, cumbersome process of resolving disputes, had kind of sapped the militancy of workers. And so when I started this project in the early 2000s, you could easily see that labor historians were kind of disappointed with the way things turned out, but they were disappointed because materially things had turned out so well. Okay, because there seemed to be a little bit of cheerleading for workers to be other than what they seemed to be. Okay, historians were pretty clear that there was some militancy amongst the auto workers, but most of it, in their terms, was of white workers trying to prevent black workers from gaining entry into auto factory jobs or into their neighborhoods. So there was a lot of militancy, but I'm thinking mainly of the famous book by Tom Segru, Origins of the Urban Crisis, which looks at that. And also, we know that decentralization of the auto industry away from Detroit, hurt a lot of African Americans especially, but all auto workers in Metro Detroit, and that automation within plants also reduced the number of jobs. And my research doesn't do anything to dispute those notions at all. In addition, women auto workers lost most of the ground that they had gained in the auto industry when it was the defense industry during World War II. They did suffer employment discrimination and sexual harassment on the job, oftentimes by fellow union members. The UAW, which was male dominated, only showed limited solidarity with women members and also with African American members in this period. When you look at those last few points, you can see that there might be a counter narrative emerging, that not everybody was experiencing the post-war period as a time of prosperity, gains, and all this. But on the other hand, the narrative of this being the golden age, really did dominate those alternative viewpoints. And that is especially true now because unionization rates are so low, income inequality is so high in this country that now a lot of the same historians who used to be disappointed at the material gains they saw in the 1950s are now saying that does look pretty good, by comparison. The relative power that the UAW had in the post-war era in the scholarship now looks like something we should be aspiring to, not something we should be disappointed by. But one thing I noticed is that not much in any of that literature actually focused on ordinary auto workers themselves. It's talking about the industry, it's projecting onto this big mass of auto workers, but there wasn't really much at all about the experiences of auto workers. There's much written about Walter Reuther, the longtime president of the United Auto Workers. There's a lot written about union policies, about infighting within the union at the highest levels, especially concerning communism. But auto workers themselves are largely absent from the story in this period. And so, that kind of cemented in my mind that there was room for an oral history project to look at this. I wondered if it might be possible to learn about the experiences of auto workers, especially in the 1950s, by interviewing people who had been auto workers in the 1950s. I wasn't looking for Walter Reuther, who of course died in a plane crash in 1970, but I wasn't looking for activists. I wasn't looking for people who had been involved in any particular struggles, but just the rank and file, just, how do they live? And based on all that was written, I even went into this project expecting to find stories about how these people handled their wealth. Did they buy cottages up north? Did they buy motorboats? New cars every year? Big vacations with the kids? What were they doing? And so, again, we all tried to be open-minded by to what we find, but those were kind of the assumptions I had going in. So the next question was, okay, I want to interview retired auto workers. Where are they? How do you find them? Okay. When I did my research on cotton mill workers, it was kind of easy. There were still a whole lot of these mill workers clustered in the old mill village. And if you interviewed one, they'd point you to the next three. And you kind of had word of mouth, snowball effect interviewing. But the Metro Detroit area is much different. There were hundreds of thousands of people who had been auto workers at some point in the 1950s. Not all of them were alive in the year 2000 or so when I started this project. But how do I locate them? Who would be willing to be interviewed? And fortunately for me, I had a running partner at the time who linked me up with the retiree chapter president at the Ypsilanti Ford plant, local, what was it, 849, I think. I met with him, Bob Bowen. I had a student at Oakland University who was a member of Local 653 at Pontiac Motor. They were phasing out, but he linked me up with the retiree director there. Had a lot of other students over the years who had relatives as well who they could point me to. And I went to a UAW summer picnic for retirees and just did my best to make a pitch for the significance of collecting oral history interviews. And enough people volunteered to make it worthwhile. Nowhere near the hundreds of thousands of people who had been auto workers, but a few dozen. And I realized quickly that there was no chance in getting anyone to pay attention to me once the bingo games and raffles started. That was it. Okay, you gotta get your pitch in quickly. So anyways, I just want to give a shout out to Bob Bowen in Ypsilanti and Bonnie Melton, who died recently in Pontiac, because they were the retiree chapter presidents who realized that maybe there was something in this, and they connected me with retirees, gave me space in their union halls to do interviews. Sometimes allowed speakers and the deliveries intervened, but it was still a safe space, for workers. And I dedicated my book to them because they were so instrumental in making this happen. So anyways, what did I learn from these oral history interviews? After conducting more than 40, which again is a small number compared to the number of workers potentially who would have been eligible to be interviewed, but it became clear that hardly anybody recalled the 1950s as a decade of secure employment and rising wages. Instead, I heard story after story emphasizing job instability and economic insecurity during the decade. And it wasn't like I was just asking questions like, did you experience job security or insecurity? I was just talking with people about their lives, and over the course of the discussions, what did you do next? What did you do next? What did you do next? That stood out in my mind. Although most of the people I interviewed tried to be auto workers during the 50s and considered themselves to be auto workers during the 50s, layoffs were so frequent that most of them were actually auto workers only about half the time. Okay. All of them had secondary support systems, often including unemployment benefits, but almost always involving alternate jobs. Secondary jobs, sometimes third jobs. So here is a partial list of the positions held by the people I interviewed during layoffs during the 1950s, okay? It's kind of long, but you'll get the point, I think. Trailer home washer, cab driver, department store clerk, bank employee, telephone pole installer, promotional event searchlight operator, feed store worker, cyclone fence installer, moving company worker, University of Michigan Law Club janitor, junior high cafeteria worker, insurance repair construction worker, winery employee, trash hauler, chicken farmer, wallpaperer, Army surplus store employee, barber, berry picker, cotton picker, golf caddy, and soldier. right? And there are more. And so the question was like, what does it mean to be an auto worker if you're doing all these other things as well? And what does this tell us about what it meant to be an auto worker during these years? I was just kind of confused trying to figure this out. But there are some other good stories in there. Edith Arnold was the woman who was a junior high cafeteria worker, okay? And she had always wanted to work in an auto plant, but her husband said, nope, 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 nope. You know, it's too coarse for a woman. There's dirty language, there's hijinks. Yep, that's not where you can work. And so she eventually, you know, convinced him that that maybe he could afford, you know, better booze and maybe a better car if she worked. But she got laid off and got that job at the junior high cafeteria. And she said that she has never heard such foul language as she did in a junior high cafeteria, that it was a far worse environment for a woman to be in, you know, than a mere auto plant. So I thought that was pretty interesting. So anyways, what I wondered then is that, you know, did my interview evidence mean anything? You know, this is only a few dozen people. Were these just the outliers who couldn't figure out how to make it in a time when everyone else did? You know, what did I have here? Almost everyone I interviewed had been quite young in the 50s by definition, because I was starting in the year 2000. So I really didn't have, you know, a sense of what older workers might have experienced during the 1950s. You know, so how could I determine whether or not I had anything that was representative? And I thought about it. I thought, well, I could do 100 more interviews. I could do 200 more interviews. I could do 1,000 more interviews, but I'd still have that same representativeness problem given the large number of people who had been auto workers. Okay, I'm not trained in the social sciences to, you know, figure out exactly what I would have to do to have a representative sample, but you can't make people talk to you either, right? You know, so it's a bit of a sticky problem. Also, if anyone has ever tried to transcribe audio, it's hard. It's really time consuming. And I wanted to finish the project either before I died or before I retired, one or the other. Okay. You know, so, and so I'm trying to figure out what to do. And what I chose to do, not knowing what it would bear, was I chose to read Detroit newspapers, you know, throughout this period. I read the Detroit Free Press, I read the Detroit News, I read the Michigan Chronicle, the African American Weekly. I read all of those on microfilm at the University of Brad Library. Some of them are digitized now, but not back when I was doing the research. I think I have the audience who will understand what I mean. Have you ever read microfilm on a microfilm reader? And how did it go for you?
Wasn't easy.
Wasn't easy. Okay. You know, yeah, it's kind of a form of torture. I think, you know, yeah. Well, they had advanced to automatic advancing, you know, of the screen, but you still, nothing's digitized, nothing's indexed. And so your eyes are the Google algorithm, you know, just looking around the page, and it's kind of grainy, you know, trying to figure out what's there. And I'm looking for stories that might have something to do with auto workers. And I could do it for about 4 hours max before I felt like maybe I was stoned and I had to walk home, you know. I don't know what I looked like coming out of there. But anyways, it was old school research. And it was exhilarating, it was exhausting, because almost every day there was all kinds of stuff about the auto industry, about auto workers. You know, the Free Press and News dedicated a lot of staff to covering all aspects of the industry, and there was just so much to learn and so much to cover. I could tell a story about the last of the dinosaur microfilm readers that everyone wanted because it was the best one, and if anyone had it, then you had to, you know, wait, and finally it ended up at the art history library. And so I pilfered microfilm over to the art history library, because there aren't any librarians here, are there? Oh, okay. I always took it back, but rather than have them escort me over there, which they didn't want to do, you know, I went over there, used the reader, brought it back, and all was done well. But anyways, I had no idea how long this would take. It took several years. I teach and I have other responsibilities, but I was reading microfilm pretty steadily for about 5 years. And so what did I find in the newspapers? I mentioned there were a lot of articles, but the newspaper evidence just overwhelmingly supported and enhanced what the interviewees had told me. What I learned is that even according to industrialists, auto executives, UAW leaders, ordinary workers, local business leaders, they all agreed that in no way did the auto industry provide secure employment and stable employment or rising incomes in this period. It was remarkable because that was about the only thing that group of people agreed on in the period. They had lots of disagreements about who caused strikes and what was going on and all this, but was the industry stable? No. And so I'm curious about how all the myths got started, but that's not the focus really of my talk right now. African-American workers had it worse than whites, to be sure. There's no doubt that that discrimination was real, opportunities were less. But auto work was unstable and insecure for just about everybody. There were vast ebbs and flows in auto employment during the decade. There were some persistent, unpredictable bursts of short-term unemployment. I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But there were only 3 periods I could detect in the whole decade of the 1950s, a few months in 1950, a few months in 1953, a few months in 1955, when there was anything like a few consecutive months of full-time employment, stable employment in the industry. Most new auto workers in the decade were hired during those brief upsurges, mostly in 1953. I wondered why so many people I interviewed started their auto jobs in 1953, and I found my answer in the newspaper research. And that meant as well that my small sampling was a bit more representative than I had thought, because there was a lot of turnover in auto work, and a lot of the new workers were hired in that year. So anyways, a little bit about the sources. Editorially, both the Detroit Free Press and the Detroit News thought that Walter Reuther and the UAW were leading Detroit, the auto industry, and the nation into a socialist nightmare future. Okay, I mean, the editorial positions were uniform. This is the guy's a genius, but he's wrong-headed. At the same time, both editorial boards were unabashed civic boosters. They were predicting a bright future for the city. They wanted there to be full employment. They wanted the auto industry to thrive. They wanted everything to be going well. The Michigan Chronicle generally supported the UAW's larger mission, but they emphasized the persistence of racial discrimination within the union, the hiring gates, and the larger community. It was a good counterpoint to the Free Press and the News in those years. Newspapers are hardly perfect sources, for sure. And it turns out neither are oral history interviews. Okay, there can be distortion, odd memories, and this and that. But everything was pointing in the same direction towards this being a time of insecurity and instability. I also just took a little detour one summer and read Fortune magazine, leading business magazine, and they also said the auto industry was wildly unstable, but they blamed it on workers and just saw it in terms of the challenges that auto executives faced. But by implication, they were telling the same story, but just from a different perspective. Okay, so my thesis in the book, in this talk, is that contrary to what I thought was true, contrary to what scholars thought was true, contrary to what most people in the public think was true, this was a decade of job instability and economic insecurity. And so, I put that out there in the world with the book, and people are scratching their heads. Just like no one wanted that to be true back in the 1950s, no one really wants it to be true right now. But again, what we do is we rely on our evidence to see if we convince people. So so far, so good, if that's the way to put it. But anyways, when I refer to Detroit in the talk, I'm usually just meaning Metro Detroit, mainly Wayne County, parts of neighboring Macomb and Oakland counties. Detroit, that's how Detroit was defined in the 1950s by the Michigan Employment Security Commission for determining employment and unemployment. And in Dearborn, we all know that the Rouge plant is not in Detroit, right? But if you try to talk about Detroit auto workers and leave out the Rouge plant, you've left out a lot. Just like if you leave out Pontiac Motor, which is not in Detroit, you leave out a lot, or the Dodge main plant, which is in Hamtramck. So they consider the metro area as Detroit, and so that's really what I'm saying in my talk as well. I'll probably refer to some unemployment figures. One of the things that I realized with all of this research was that unemployment figures were just approximations at best throughout this period. They were calculated through a combination of assessing unemployment claims, checking in on a few targeted employers, And they were really just best guess estimates as to what was going on. I think they are useful for comparative purposes. You get a sense of general trends, but sometimes the numbers are way too precise to even be possibly accurate, and they would change moment to moment as well. There are so many auto-related workplaces, each with fluctuating employment totals, often on a daily or weekly basis, that really any number would have been immediately outdated. And also, you were counted as employed if you worked as little as 1 hour per week. Okay, and so it makes it hard to assess unemployment, versus employment. Short weeks were common, far less than 40-hour weeks. And it's really hard to wade through the statistics that way. But if you see unemployment high, you have to figure that there probably is a lot of employment that is far from full employment. And just like it's impossible to determine unemployment figures so accurately, it's also really difficult, it turns out, to figure out how much workers earned. And that's the centerpiece of our traditional literature about the period. Wage rates were set by the contract. You could look at the wage rate, okay? And what historians have done is pretty much what economists did at the time. They multiplied the hourly wage by 40, then by roughly 50, the number of weeks in a year, and voila, you have what auto workers earned. But layoffs were so common in reality that it was misleading to assume any correlation between hourly earnings and monthly or annual incomes. Hourly wage rates didn't mean anything if you were laid off. More on that as we go along here. And then it's also worth remembering that from 45 to 60, the largest employer in Detroit was actually Chrysler. It was followed, sometimes closely, sometimes a little bit distantly by Ford. But those companies had usually between 70,000 and 130,000 local employees in that decade, a lot more than they have today. GM upped its presence with the Willow Run plant just a little bit west of here, and then a few more operations in Detroit. So by the end of the 50s, the big three each had about 70,000 employees peak in the Metro Detroit area. So it's a way of saying that Chrysler throughout most of this period had a lot more to do with the fate of Detroit than GM did. GM's presence was more so Flint and Lansing. All right. I didn't even mention the decline of the independents, Hudson, Packard, Kaiser Frazer, Studebaker, that resulted in a lot of instability in the decade as well. So anyways, what did I find here? According to most accounts, even today, pent-up demand for automobiles was big because of World War II, when no cars were built, and wartime savings were huge. There wasn't a lot to spend on. So that combined to create a boom in the auto industry during the early post-war years. But I found that years after the end of the war, automakers were still waiting for that post-war boom. In mid-1945, automakers had hoped for a quick transition to civilian production. And reconversion, it wasn't fully completed until November that year, but that's still pretty quick, after the war ending in August. And so they predicted an output at an annual rate of 5 million vehicles. Okay, we're going to just hit the ground running. We're going to produce. Okay, but it didn't work out that way. It turns out that there were just a whole lot of problems. Some will sound kind of familiar. Supply chain issues. Okay, now we think about computer chips or something, but in this period, if you think about the thousands and thousands of parts that went into a car and all the disruption of converting the wartime production and trying to convert back, there were shortages of just about everything. And sometimes the shortages were caused by strikes. There were a lot of labor conflicts in this early post-war period. Kelsey Hayes, a major Ford supplier, saw a strike of 4,500 workers right around the end of the war, and they supplied the Rouge plant. So the Rouge plant had to shut down just as it was trying to gear up in post-war production. That's like 40,000 layoffs immediately, boom, just like that, as long as the strike lasted. In September 1945, Henry Ford II complained that fewer cars had been produced in the previous month than he had expected to roll off the assembly lines every 3 hours. Okay, so things were not getting off to a fast start. Let's see, among the most important missing parts that slowed down production were screws, nuts, bolts, and washers. Okay, but imagine a car without them. Okay. Anyways, there was a glass workers strike that halted almost all the assembly lines in the auto industry for many weeks shortly after the war ended. If you didn't have glass, no big deal. Who needs windshields? Who needs windows, right? Everything was related. And so let's see, by early November 1945, total domestic auto production for the year had reached 19,000. Okay. And then the target was 500,000 at that point. So that's not much of a boom. It's kind of a slow fuse at this point. All right. All right. So I think I'll kind of skip over, or I'll just make brief mention of the famous General Motors strike in 1945, 1946. Some of you may have heard about it. That's when Walter Reuther kind of rose to national prominence because he demanded a 30% wage increase with no increases in the cost of cars, demanded that GM open its books if it couldn't pay, and the strike lasted, oh gosh, weeks and weeks and weeks, 113 days, okay? And, labor historians have argued until they're blue in the face about whether this was a wise strategy, an unwise strategy. But what I found out in reading the newspapers is that the whole industry was shut down the whole time because of all these strikes. The glass strike alone was enough to do it. There was a copper strike, I think, as well. And so GM had no incentive to settle. None of its competitors was making a car. But that also meant is that hundreds of thousands of Detroit auto workers were not working. They weren't making a paycheck. And so for many months after the end of the war, employment was really sporadic and people had to try to make do as best they could. There was a big steel strike that started in January 1946. That shut down the auto industry. What else? Coal miners strike in May of 1946. Well, without coal, guess how much steel you have? None. Okay, without steel, you don't build cars. There was that kind of domino effect, up and down the production system here. So anyways, there was another round of steel and coal strikes later in the year, but it gets redundant. In fact, as I was doing the microphone research, I started to laugh sometimes. I was like, this is insane. Things never calmed down, and they never did. With no UAW strike fund to help them, okay, these laid off workers, the ones who are on strike, and then no strike fund for people who are collateral damage or laid off because of strikes. A lot of workers had exhausted their savings, cash in their war bonds. Here's one GM striker. He said, I was just talking to a fellow on the picket line. This is Albert Winters, age 43. His wife is going to have a child. He's behind in his rent. There's sickness in his family. A 26-year-old on the picket line said, we've had to tighten our belts, tighten them a lot. I don't know how some exist. Another one said, I worked 2 weeks and 3 days and was laid off when the GM strike was called. This was a veteran who was laid off at a different plant. He had to support himself on his $200 military mustering out pay. Okay. And he got some work as a part-time janitor. This is right from the get-go. Let's see. More stuff on strikes. But let's see. Unauthorized wildcat strikes also did a lot to disrupt production. I was talking about strikes that were sanctioned by the unions, like the GM strike in 1945, 1946. But if one or two people were angry about their situation in their department and they decided not to work, they could shut down their department. That would shut down their plant, which would shut down all the plants feeding into that plant, all the assembly plants following it. And that continuously resulted in tens of thousands of layoffs, sometimes for days, sometimes for a week. But again, I started to look at it from the perspective of the workers. You don't know when you're going to work. Losing a week of pay is a big deal. Losing a day of pay is a big deal, for an awful lot of these workers. All right, let's see. Unemployment compensation was helpful at about $20 a week plus $2 a week per child. Okay, the average UAW hourly wage was $1.30 at that point. So that could get you up, to half of your take-home income. But the problem is that if you had less than a year of seniority, or you had an interrupted job history, you didn't qualify for unemployment pay. And so because of the disruptions, because of so many people having started recently, there wasn't as much availability of unemployment as you think. Many laid off workers traveled to stay with relatives, often in West Virginia, Kentucky, Arkansas, or northern Michigan. One point, I remember reading an article about how so many Detroit area workers went back to Harlan County in Kentucky that it overloaded all the relatives in Harlan County. They wanted them to go back. You know, they didn't have room for them, didn't have food for them. There were no jobs for them. But that was part of the survival system. Most of those who stayed in Detroit tried to find odd jobs, the secondary jobs I mentioned earlier, but it was more difficult when there were so many people looking for those kinds of jobs. Corner grocery stores extended credits when possible, medical bills went unpaid, along with rent, mortgage payments, insurance premiums, and utility bills. There are all kinds of articles in the papers about repossessions, you know, about evictions, you know, just about the court docket filling up with all these cases that are related to layoffs. Auto production could also be affected by extreme weather. There was only one pipeline that brought natural gas up from Texas and Oklahoma into Michigan. It's also served parts of Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York State. If it got really cold, which it did on occasion, people had to figure out who got preference, right? And the auto industry didn't get priority. Schools, hospitals, homes got priority. And so sometimes the auto industry was shut down for as much as 3 weeks just because it was cold. Okay. And also it could get hot. Okay. You know, sometimes workers went on heat strikes. If the temperature was really high, these plants were not air conditioned. Oftentimes auto workers slept overnight on Belle Isle. And you'd hear all these alarms going off and then people would report to work, but the industry sometimes shut down just because it was so hot outside. Military service also disrupted auto work for an awful lot of people. I mentioned soldier at the tail end of my long list, but almost every male worker faced the draft. You know, in this Cold War decade, some of them tried to get their military service out of the way early, especially if they wanted to get into the skilled trades. Every male I interviewed had some kind of story to tell about how they had just gotten settled into an auto job, and then Uncle Sam drafted me, and I went to Korea, or I had to go to Berlin, had to go to training, this, that, and the other. So here's one of the things that I really try to emphasize in the book. All of the macroeconomic statistics in this immediate post-war era and on through the 1950s indicated that these were boom times. Okay, once you know, total factory. Once you got past that initial disruption in late 1945, factory employment was measured by people who were on the payroll of the auto companies. So by 1948, manufacturing employment reached a post-war high of what? 489,000, a million people were employed in the Metro Detroit area. Ford had 80,000 hourly workers. They reported their wages, you know, super high, and all this. But the catch was that the total employment figures and the calculation of wages didn't match the reality of the workers themselves. Most of them had experienced repeated layoffs, short weeks, and even business leaders were worried, you know, underneath the hoopla about the statistics. The National Association of Manufacturers President Morris Sayer visited Detroit and told the auto executives there and other industrialists, security represented by the steadiest job possible is the first concern of every working American. And he warned that the free market system might not last unless they solve this problem. He recognized how insecure employment was, not the usual mention or not the usual message of the National Association of Manufacturers. The 1949 recession is something that does make history books. Okay. What? There was a recession then? There was. But it's usually viewed as a blip on the screen in a period of general post-war prosperity. But it was really severe for Detroit auto workers living in real time. It's one thing to look back on the past and say, oh, it was only a 1 or 10% drop, or but if you're living through it in real time and you are unemployed, some have said that that's the difference between the definition of a recession and a depression. A recession is when someone else is unemployed. A depression is when you're unemployed. But nonetheless, heading into 1949, there were 750,000 unsold cars on dealers' lots throughout the country. Okay, that's a lot in that time period. Okay, when they're looking at annual production, maybe in the 5, 6, 7 million range tops. And so anyone could see that auto plants were likely to ratchet back production. You don't just keep making cars if you can't sell them. You have to let the inventory sell off, and that meant unemployment. board insisted in this recession that the UAW could help ensure long-term security for its members by accepting an 18-month pay freeze in upcoming contract negotiations. That was their demand. And the personnel director, John Bugas, said the post-war buggy ride of ever higher wages, costs, and prices is over. Okay. He was really kind of tapping into that narrative that these were overpaid, pampered workers, who have it too good, and they have to take some cuts. They have to make some kind of sacrifice. But the problem from the workers' perspective is that this buggy ride he was referring to had never really got anywhere. The unemployment layoffs had dominated their lives. Detroit Board of Commerce officer Harvey Campbell argued that those who built cars, the auto workers, had become lazy and dependent. He said absenteeism is rife. They work 4 days to make enough money to enjoy themselves for the next 3 days. Okay. Auto workers had only themselves to blame, he said. They have opportunities if they care to take advantage of them. Okay. You flip that around, the auto workers are saying, well, you only let us work 4 days a week, or we only get to work 3 days a week, and our bills are consistent. It's possible there were some people who could work 2 or 3 days a week and survive if you were single, if you didn't have any obligations, no children, something like that. But it was the baby boom years. And so it wasn't clear that these comments were really all that connected to reality. When Harvey Campbell said those things, unemployment in the city had reached 7.5%, and it was heavily concentrated in manufacturing. The unemployment figures were generally considered to be double for manufacturing, like the auto industry. So pretty significant. Caution ruled in factory hiring offices. There were always some entry-level positions because of the high turnover in entry-level positions. Sometimes in the 50s, entry-level positions had a turnover rate of up to 400% per year. They were churning people out on the really difficult, nasty entry-level jobs. But for the most part, there wasn't much turnover once people spun out of those assembly line jobs or the worst jobs. Anyways, foremen were increasingly picky for hiring. They rejected as many as 15 applicants before filling an opening. And job scarcity brought out the worst in hiring practices. Charles Wortman, who was a journalist for the Michigan Chronicle, the African-American newspaper, said the ratio of 100 whites to 1 Negro was bringing great screams of protest. It was widely recognized that women had no chance of being employed in auto plants, and neither did men over age 40. Okay. Kind of right back to the Henry Ford days in the 20s when men used to go out and buy hair dye before the hiring gates opened, so you would look younger and have a chance of getting a job. Let's see. There were simultaneous steel and coal strikes in late 1949. One woman said, "I don't know what my kids will do. It takes every penny I make to support them. I've been at the plant since the war. My man was killed in the Pacific. It will take me 4 months to catch up with what this layoff has cost me. And by then, I guess there will be another." Despite all this rampant joblessness, industry leaders pronounced 1949 to be a tremendously successful year. The Automobile Manufacturers Association reviewed the industry's accomplishments and said production moved at a fast pace throughout the entire year. Sales kept right on the heels of production, and employees worked longer, steadier, and were paid more money than in any year. Okay. A different year-end summary marveled at such record-breaking statistics while noting that it all seemed, quote, paradoxical because each month of 1949 had seen a disheartening number of strikes, shutdowns, shortages, and obstacles to production. So which is it? There was this consistent discrepancy. I returned that theme because I keep on returning to that theme. I wrote the book in a chronological structure so you could see how things developed over time. But throughout these years, with few exceptions, and the exception is usually Chrysler, the big three automakers reported fabulous profits. The auto industry as a whole was booming, even when production and sales weren't as high as automakers hoped they would be. That's in part because kind of GM set the pace for the industry, and they arranged so that they could be profitable with about 60% production capacity, and everyone else was trying to catch up with that. But the catch, as usual here, was that auto workers themselves, not the industry, suffer from layoffs and insecurity beneath those profit totals. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of the Treaty of Detroit. It's not a war treaty. Well, I mean, the auto workers and the automakers might have thought so. But in 1950, there was a series of contracts. The first one was signed by General Motors, then every other major automaker and supplier followed suit. The term Treaty of Detroit was given to these contracts by Fortune magazine. Okay, these contracts really are the script for thinking of the 50s as a time of prosperity and entering the middle class. That's because they did provide for wage increases, cost of living allowances, annual improvement factors, which accounted for productivity increases. They had more lavish pensions, improved health insurance, all the things that we look back at the decade on and say, yeah, that's what auto workers got, and that's what made their lives more stable, more prosperous. Okay, propelled auto workers into the middle class. Now, historians, I've mentioned to you that they're kind of a cantankerous lot, and they have disagreed about whether this is a positive or negative development. You know, better lives, higher wages. What about the militancy? Okay, but no one thought there was any chance that it didn't happen. Okay, they were just arguing about what they assumed did happen. Okay, and what I found reading through is that, well, I'll just give you a few highlights. First of all, the 1950 contract, the Treaty of Detroit with Chrysler, was achieved after a 104-day strike just to get a pension. Okay, so that means that the big chunk of Chrysler workers in the Detroit area and all their suppliers entered this Treaty of Detroit era having not had any income for over 3 months. Okay, they were desperate. In 1950, Detroit cleared its streets with shovels, hiring people to just go out and shovel. Didn't have snowplows, and so like in one big snowstorm, there were just thousands of Chrysler workers out there trying to get a little bit of money shoveling the streets of Detroit. By early March 1950, Detroit unemployment approached 200,000. That's out of 540,000 manufacturing workers. Chrysler workers ultimately won their pension, but no one was partying in the streets. Here's what Frank Lubinsky, a Chrysler striker, said, and he never wavered in his support for the strike. He supported it all the way through. But he said, I don't think we have too much to celebrate. I can't forget the banknote for $285, the payments on the washing machine, the doctor bill, the 3 light bills, 3 gas bills, 3 telephone bills, and 4 house payments. Shortly after the treaties of Detroit were signed, war broke out in Korea. Okay, and everyone thought, Detroit's going to be the arsenal of democracy again, just like in World War II. Tens of thousands, no one knows how many, could be more than 100,000 people moved to Detroit, hoping to get wartime employment. Declaration, there wasn't a declaration, but the brewing conflict did result in a surge in sales and production because everyone thought there'd be rationing. Get your car while you can, okay? And so it did look for a while like, the war is going to be good for Detroit business, all right? Rationing did kick in, steel, aluminum, and copper shortages, but they weren't given to the auto industry, and there wasn't the same kind of wartime reconversion as there was in World War II, and war contracts tended not to go to, they went to GM and Ford and Chrysler to some extent, but not to factories in Detroit for the most part. Things got desperate. The auto industry is in such dire straits that in early 1951, automakers, UAW leaders, and City of Detroit officials drafted a news release to be sent all around the country, okay, especially in that wide arc from which workers tended to come, like from Arkansas and Missouri down through Alabama and Tennessee and all this. And this is what it said. It said, attention would-be war workers, stay away from Detroit unless you have definite promise of a job in this city. If you expect a good paying job at one of the big auto plants this time, you're doomed to disappointment and hardship. Okay, that doesn't square with the idea that the Treaty of Detroit brought all this prosperity and security. It paints a different story entirely. During the war, there were always over 100,000 unemployed Detroiters. The official total reached 250,000 in August 1952. Heavily concentrated in the auto industry. At one point in 1952, 10% of all the unemployment in the entire country was concentrated in Detroit. All right. I have a lot more testimonies about how tough it was, for people. I have to pay a little bit of attention to the time here, and I'll just kind of cruise through a little bit more. You're getting the picture, though. When the Korean War restrictions were lifted, at the end of 1952 and then heading into 1953, all of a sudden the industry boomed. I told you that was one of the boom times, and that's when so many people I interviewed enter auto work. And all of a sudden, automakers are recruiting far and wide for new employees. They sent out a new memo to all the people who had received the one, a year and a half earlier, saying, "Come on to Detroit. We've got lots of jobs for you." All right. But recruitment proved difficult because of the industry's instability, which, according to one report, was, quote, "so well recognized that potential workers know that today's hiring boom can become tomorrow's layoffs." Auto workers also complained because job instability had been so severe that young Detroiters had little experience in auto work, and they found it very difficult. That's completely counter to what I always heard, that this was the period when you could not even graduate high school, show up at the auto plant hiring gate and be guaranteed a lifetime of secure employment. I've heard that. I can't even count the number of times I've heard that, okay? But that's not what the industry leaders were saying in the 1950s. They complained that most of the new hires quit after a day or two. They're a little soft. As Free Press labor writer Robert Perrin commented, quote, "anyone who has been around the state for the past few years knows full well that sooner or later the bottom is going to drop out of the job market again." This is just common knowledge, in the Detroit area. And sure enough, the production boom resulted in a saturation of the market by late 1953, really by mid-1953, and there was another big recession in Detroit in 1954. As a result, a lot of the people who were hired in 1953, they had the least seniority, they're laid off again, okay, or not even again, but I mean almost immediately, just as they were starting their careers. Detroit News editorial tried to put it in perspective. It said, "it is a fact, however unfortunate, that the industry is and always has been subject to violent fluctuations, both seasonal and otherwise. It has had need of a labor force that is readily expandable and contractile, and this need to a degree has been accommodated by the working habits of Detroit families." When I read to my students, I start to glaze over. Okay, but the Detroit News is saying, yeah, it's unstable, and you just have to deal with it, okay? And you have, but they didn't actually ask any of the workers. They just kind of pronounced, right? But desperation, not easy accommodation, was apparent outside the unemployment offices at the time. Bill Barnes said, "I'm 3 payments behind my car and furniture. I have 2 children, one 5, the other 3. Another one said, I get $27 in unemployment pay. We need that much for food alone. Besides, the kids haven't been feeling well. I owe the doctor money." This is exactly the time when the independent automakers went belly up as well. And so that meant many more thousands of Detroit auto workers out of work. By their own admission, automakers had relented a bit in early 1953 in the hiring boom by hiring African-American men, white women, the elderly, meaning over 40 years old, and those with disabilities. But when discrimination kicked in with full force, once again, when jobs were scarce, automakers and city officials complained about the number of unemployed auto workers in Detroit and called for those who had arrived during boom times to leave the area and leave the auto industry for good. There were huge debates about who's a Detroiter and who's an auto worker. And if you came in the 1950s and you were laid off, you're supposed to get out of town. Automakers and civic boosters blamed auto workers for the industry's tough times. Their high wages, the argument went, boosted the price of new cars and limited sales. But another thing I found out is that hardly any auto workers were able to purchase new cars. Okay, they could purchase used cars, and that's exactly the way the market was set up for them. They bought the used cars. The wealthy 14% of Detroiters bought new cars. Those who did buy new cars often had them repossessed when layoffs meant they couldn't meet their payments. Auto workers are always portrayed as the elite of the blue-collar workers in the country, and they were buying new cars. And there was one time when there were over 250,000 unemployed workers in Detroit, and one commentator said they could all have their jobs back if they would just buy new cars. Yeah, anyways, let's see. By late summer 1954, Chrysler's lowest seniority workers have been laid off for over a year, and the company reclassified the status of 20,000 of them as permanent. Defense Secretary and former GM head Charles Wilson, okay, everyone thought, he's going to be on the auto industry side. He's, from GM. He inflamed the situation when he criticized those who had accepted unemployment benefits during the 1954 downturn. He said, "I have lots of sympathy for those without jobs. I've always liked bird dogs better than kennel-fed dogs. The bird dog is one that will go out and hunt for its food. The kennel-fed dog is one that waits until it is brought to him." Auto workers and union officials were pretty pissed off, okay, at that characterization, okay. But then again, came 1955. I have to rush, but 1955 was the year that people have in mind without really thinking about it when they think of the 1950s. There was full employment for quite a bit of the year, okay. Workers enjoyed steady employment. 9 million vehicles were produced, okay, just like millions more than in 1954. Yet those on the job worried that the good times might not last. Jim Basden, who was from UAW Local 212, he said, we're working from 9 to 12 hours a day. We don't mind the extra loot as we have lots of fun spending it. But I shudder to think what is going to happen later on. The saturation point is inevitable. And Walter Reuther was making the same point when he said anyone who thought that 1955 would be a boom year must be smoking king-size marijuana cigarettes, right? Indeed, it turns out that demand for the vehicles couldn't keep pace with the production. At year's end, almost 1 million cars sat unsold on dealers' lots. Auto production was scaled back, and that lasted for roughly 2 years. My interviewees kept telling me those were the doldrums. Hardly any employment, trying to work down the inventories. Pensions were also meager in the 1950s. Ford had a big celebration for its 10,000th retiree, brought the news crews out to Jim Wolf's house. Hey, you're the retiree. What you looking forward to doing? He didn't say going to Disneyland. He said, well, I got to get another job, okay? And the house is in disrepair. And maybe he said his son might hire him, okay? Pension and unemployment or pension and social security benefits total $151 a month, less than half of what he earned before retirement. And he had been working since the 1920s. So that's what he was up against. There weren't any more such celebrations. They didn't do that again. Even skilled workers were upset in the late 1950s because of layoffs and compression. The contracts had actually reduced the monetary distance between skilled workers and unskilled workers. By the end of 1957, 2/3 of skilled workers in Detroit were laid off in the auto industry. And they were the ones who were supposed to be impervious to layoffs because of their skill. But if your job was repairing the tool and die machines, the things that were involved in production, if there's no production, you don't get to work. The firemen, the Boilermakers, they might be working, but not others. Okay. According to the U.S. Department of Commerce, nationally, 1957 outdistanced 1956 to become America's best year ever. Okay. By contrast, 1957 in Detroit was marked, according to the Michigan Employment Security Commission, by, quote, continuing serious unemployment, high payment of jobless benefits, and concurrent reduction of manufacturing employment to the lowest point since 1949. And that was true despite the 4th best car output ever for the year. When asked about high unemployment in Detroit, White House aide Howard Pyle said, the right to suffer is one of the joys of a free economy, just as the right to prosper is. There weren't a lot of friends in the Eisenhower administration, okay? Making matters worse, a lot of people who had extended themselves when they were making money in 55, now were in trouble. They had overextended and were laid off. Auto companies, business leaders, local union leaders even told unemployed workers to leave the area, forget auto work, find something else to do. The editors of the Detroit News insisted that the only answer was, quote, the gradual absorption of the displaced workers by other trades and businesses. Get out of auto work. There's no future in it. And then things got bad. The 1958 recession even does make the history books as a real dire situation, but it was just, the nadir, really the lowest point in what had been a very problematic decade, okay? Let's see, Henry Ford II said when there were 265,000 unemployed people in April 1958, he said, if there is no business like show business, certainly the auto industry runs at a close second for glamour, excitement, and adventure. There's no other business with anything like the same elements of risk, big stakes, feverish competition, ecstatic highs, and gloomy lows. There was this disconnect that wasn't new, but it was really pronounced. The only real bright spot coming out of the recession was demand for small, fuel-efficient cars, but they weren't generally made in Detroit, so that was a problem. One report in 1960 described Detroit's economy as, quote, a baffling conglomerate of millions of sales, paychecks, and layoffs. Clues to the puzzle are found in a welter of statistics, comparisons, and indices, which sometimes appear contradictory. What is happening? Which way are we headed? My interviews stopped in 1960 for the most part, and some of my external reviewers said, "Why didn't you just keep on going with the story?" One thing I'm hoping I've convinced you of is that the evidence points to this decade as not being one of security and stability and rising wages and entering the middle class. That doesn't mean that everyone I talked to was miserable in that decade. They didn't know what they were supposed to be experiencing. When you're young, when you're struggling, raising kids, sometimes you look back on those years as really great years because you survived so much. You accomplished so much under tough circumstances. I didn't talk to anyone who wanted to go back and relive those years. Okay. And so that's really my message. I think that we run the risk sometimes of reading history backwards. If auto workers who survived all the layoffs and all the turmoil in the industry and came out with high wages and good pensions and good benefits in the 70s and 80s, if they exist, then certainly they existed in earlier decades. We forget that people live in real time. They don't live in retrospect. We don't know what people are going to look back on us and say about us, 30 years from now, or what kinds of things are going to project on us. Also, that macroeconomic statistics don't tell the story of how ordinary people live. That's true in our day, it's true back then. And those are some of the big takeaways, I guess. And in the largest sense, it really just causes us to rethink the whole mid-century experience of America, because the post-war boom is really seen as central to America's identity in these years. And if it wasn't true for auto workers, then who was it true for? And so that's my story. I really appreciate you enduring it. I'm happy to take any questions you might have. Yeah, go ahead.
Knowing what you know.
Yeah.
What year was it when that $5 day started for Ford Motor?
That was 1914, January 1st. Yep.
1914.
Yeah.
So if you were going to write a timeline, just knowing what you know now, because I know you concentrated on the 50s.
Yeah.
Then it had to be in 1914. For many years, it was probably pretty good. And then you hit the war, and then it comes out of the war. Then you hit World War II, and now we're in the 50s. And it sounds to me like the second half of the 50s was better than the first half of the 50s. But once you got into the 60s and 70s, you mentioned this earlier. When I graduated high school in 1972, a ton of the guys I went to high school with went to Ford's, Chryslers. I went to Chryslers or GM, walked in, got a job, started a week later. Yeah. I mean, everybody that went to any one of the big three got a job and they started a week later. So the 70s had to be a very prosperous, good year. The 60s, would you say that was what? Pretty prosperous compared to the 50s, better, worse? Well,
I mean, no one's done that kind of fine-grained research, and I don't dispute your experiences at all. I'm not saying that no one ever got hired,
right.
But I would guess that a lot of the people in your group also saw disruptions in the 1970s because of the oil embargoes in 1973, 1979, all kinds of layoffs. But what was different is that the UAW by that point had negotiated for basically 95% supplemental unemployment benefits. So you could be laid off, but you're still getting your full paycheck, and you didn't notice it. In the 50s, you were lucky to get 55%, and that was only for a certain amount of time, and only if you had an uninterrupted employment history before then. So I'm not. I would want to do that kind of fine-grained approach.
Wasn't going to dispute it.
Yeah.
I only worked a couple of years when I went to college.
Yeah.
But what year would you consider if there was a post-war boom?
Well, yeah. In my book, I argue that if there could be a year or at least 7 months of a year that would classify as a post-war boom, it would be 1955. But I do point out that that's kind of a long fuse. Does that even qualify as a post-war boom at that point?
Right.
Now, the economy was booming. There's no doubt about that. The overall economy was booming. No one can dispute the amount of housing that was built, the highways that were built. The industrial infrastructure was expanding. That actually hurt the auto industry to some extent because there was so much demand for steel. There was so much demand for steel that it was rationed. At one point, automakers were scouring farmyards around the state, trying to see if there were old, rusty pieces of farm equipment that they could turn into cars. Okay, and they found millions of pounds of it. But it turns out that the steel industry was building new steel mills. That took steel. The railroad industry was expanding. More goods were moved by rail in the 50s than by truck, and railroad cars required steel. All of the petroleum refineries needed steel. The Cold War required steel for defense. And so there I'm sorry?
Yeah, Mackinac Bridge.
Yeah, the Mackinac Bridge. Yeah, there were all kinds of competing interests, for that. So I'm kind of losing track a bit, but you asked when the post-war boom was. But what I'm saying is that, as the post-war boom has been defined, like 25 years of sustained prosperity with just a few minor glitches, that didn't happen. Okay. And the more people have looked into various industries, the more they've seen that for workers themselves, instability was the norm, not the rule.
Thank you.
Yeah. I appreciate hearing about your experiences. There's one thing I know as an oral historian, there's always something I don't know, and I can't possibly account for everyone's experiences. Yeah. Yes.
Did anybody you interview say anything about being an 89-day wonder?
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah, that was common. Yeah.
Was that mostly Chrysler?
It was everybody.
Everybody.
And sometimes people thought it was related to race, but it was everybody. What that meant is that you were on probation for your first 90 days when you're hired in. You gained seniority on the 90th day, I think, or after 90 days, whatever. But and so it was very common for people to be hired and laid off, just before they reach that 90-day threshold. Now the same thing is accomplished by just hiring temp workers, right? But that was very common, and it's very disruptive. And sometimes you could fire somebody for a supposed rules violation. They're not really established in the union. They kind of fade away. But yeah, that was really common. Other questions? Yeah.
Thanks. In your interviews, is there anything that comes to mind about there was the discussion about militancy in the early years, the 30s, 40s. What was the work like for the union stewards?
Yeah. That's a good question. I did talk to a few people who became shop stewards, some men, some women. And that was hard work. Because at that stage, well, the UIW just had its first democratic election for its leadership in its history, one person, one vote. But to the extent there was democracy within the UAW in the 1950s, it was at that level. Shop stewards were elected by their fellow workers. The unit might not be entirely their particular department, but it was pretty local. People knew who they were. And so, you always, as a shop steward, had to weigh in balance, right? Do you think this case has merit? Should it be pursued? If the person thinks it should be pursued and you don't, does that mean you won't be reelected next time? Will you, generate opposition to you? And so some of the people I talked to took every grievance that came to them and just bulldogged it to death. They're just going to fight everything imaginable. And that could sometimes lead to the impression that the UAW is defending people who shouldn't be defended, right? But if you didn't do that as a shop steward, then you get a reputation for not going to bat for so-and-so. And I definitely, I talked to one person who was elected, reelected, then bounced for that reason. But in terms of workload, that would vary. If there were workload for the steward, depended a lot on workloads in the factory. When jobs were being retimed, reassessed, that could result in a lot of grievances, over workload. And then if there happened to be a cantankerous boss who was arbitrary, that could result in a lot of grievances. But a good shop steward would try to resolve these issues before they entered the formal grievance procedure. That would be the goal, if that makes sense. That's still a lot of work, but it wouldn't necessarily show up in the official records. GM estimated, or UAW in GM plants estimated that about 3/4 of conflicts were resolved before they ever became formal grievances. And shop stewards would have been right on the front line of trying to negotiate that. One of the women I talked to realized that women were being discriminated against on recalls. She was working for Bonnie Moore at the time and had been laid off. When she got recalled, she realized that some of her male co-workers who had less seniority had been called back already. And so that inspired her to file a grievance. She wanted other women who also qualified for this grievance to join with her, and they wouldn't do it. They were afraid of rocking the boat. And so she went ahead, took all the money, then they resented her for that in her telling of the story. And so she decided, I'll become a shop steward and I'll fight for women. And she did, but she had that same kind of problem where some women were with her and others just thought, why are you stepping out of line and all this? And so she got tired of it and quit. So it wasn't the workload that drove her out, but it was the lack of solidarity within her department. As she told the story anyway. Yeah. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's the hardest thing to get at. What was it like on an individual level, inside the plants? Yeah. Anything else?
All right, thank you.
I really appreciate you being here. Okay, yeah, that's all right.